Pundits say the global economy is looking ahead to a very difficult new year amid a significant slowdown in growth and high inflation in many countries. So is stagflation a tangible concern? Are the risks of a recession also rising? How does Korea look to fare amid these challenges? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Economic prospects for next year remain bleak amid Russia's war in Ukraine, China's zero-COVID policy, North Korea's nuclear ambitions, and in general high inflation aggravating the cost of living for many across the globe. For more on the local and global economy, I have Professor Kim Yong-jin from Sogang University here in the studio. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure.
Good to see you.
Right. I also have Professor Yang Jun-sok from the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Happy to be here.
Right. Professor Kim, we'll start with you then. Pundits believe stagflation will hit a number of countries next year. That being said, do start by telling us what stagflation is exactly, and is this also a concern for South Korea?
Absolutely, yes. As you mentioned, we'll experience, rare stagflation next year. According to a recent Bank of America poll survey, 92% of fund managers expect a period of high inflation and low economic growth. That is what is called the stagflation. Stagflation can be characterized by three things. First, slow economic growth, and second, high unemployment rate, and third, inflation. So the combination of these three is really, really tough to handle, because if you want to correct one, and it will exacerbate all other things. So there is not much of polished tools to address the concerns. And let's say, for example, policymakers want to address slow economic growth. What they have to do, they have to put more money into the market or cut tax. But it will cause huge inflation or price hike. So it is really tough to control those kind of stagflations. I believe economists believe the stagflation is almost impossible to happen. Since 1970s, oil crisis caused stagflations. But we see that is repeatedly in the developed economies. Next year, I believe, we see the simultaneous appearance in our economy of slow economic growth and high inflation rate, and also high unemployment rate.
Right. And that being said, Professor Yang, some pundits claim that South Korea should seek to slash corporate tax and perhaps red tape to prevent or a stagflation. What do you say?
Well, cutting red tape is always good, and cutting corporate taxes may be useful, but they're not going to do anything for the short run. For the red tape, usually red tape is, for a company, it's sort of a death of 1,000 cuts. You have small costs, but there's so many of them that you lose profitability. So you're going to have to cut a lot of red tape to make the costs fall down a lot. But it's usually very difficult just to remove one item of red tape, and you're going to have to repeatedly take away a lot of it. So it definitely has to be done. But I don't think it'll have a very much effect in the short run. Corporate taxes, somewhat similar. Before the pandemic, United States and Europe tried to cut corporate taxes, and it didn't really increase investment by all that much. So it seems that even if you cut corporate taxes, if you do not have an increase in investment, if you do not have an increase in demand, then companies will just wait to invest until they see an increase in demand. And we're probably not going to see that much of an increase in demand this year or next year, both domestic and exports. And in addition, the corporate tax plan that the government has announced really doesn't cut corporate taxes by all that much. And what I mean by that is it cuts the top 25% rate and makes it down to the next highest rate, 22%. So it'll help the highest, most firms with the largest profits. It also cuts the corporate taxes for the small and medium-sized enterprises in the second lowest tax bracket. But again, you're not cutting corporate taxes for all companies. You're cutting corporate taxes for some small and medium-sized businesses and the largest companies. So I think the effect is going to be limited, even if they do impose a corporate tax. And in addition to that, again, it's not going to make itself felt until we get an increase in demand, which is going to be after the stagflation.
Right, I see. And staying with stagflation, Professor Kim, is it true that stagflation is a phenomenon that can last for many years, as was the case back in the 1970s in the US, which you mentioned earlier? Mm-hmm. In fact, do tell us a bit about the stagflation that the US suffered in the 1970s.
Right. As far as I remember, the stagflation the US experienced in the 1970s is, just the first one in its kind. Like I mentioned, the economists believed, till then, a stagflation would be impossible. But that happened. At the time, due to an embargo by OPEC countries, that is Association of Oil Producing Countries, the energy prices skyrocketed, which resulted in crude oil price, doubling from 1973 to 1975. And that also resulted in huge inflations. That's what happened. And then also the recession was experienced, especially for the countries like emerging market and developing countries. Just like today, at the time, there was a global real low interest rate. And then there were like a syndicated loan market surged. And then emerging economies had huge debts. That also caused that kind of collapse of those financial systems. And so at the time, what happened in the U.S. was, interest rate, hiked up to 20%. You see then an unemployment rate reached double digit. It was really, really tough for people to live. And also the value of stock market, the stock market actually lost values. Almost 50% of values in 20 months period. That was huge, and it actually lasted, I believe, 1973 to 1982, almost a decade. That was a huge time for everybody, And how could they overcome that, recession or stagflations? Number one was, price control. That's very, very high, tight price control was there. And the second one was wage freeze. Done by President Nixon in 1971 and 1972. And also there were a lot of restructuring and re-engineering activities which improved the productivity of companies. So these three factors together contribute to overcome the stagflation.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Professor Yang, Professor Kim mentioned the term recession, which has also been making quite a bit of headlines. And that being said, perhaps you could start by defining the term recession for us as an economist. And of course, what are the chances of a recession here in South Korea next year? Okay,
well, to start with the conclusion first, there is no real good definition of a recession. It just means slow growth, and it could be different from country to country. Taking the U.S. as an example, whether U.S. is in a recession or not, it's actually decided by a committee in a group called NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, and they look at not only the growth rate, but employment rate and other economic factors, production and other factors as well. And it's not very transparent on how they decide whether something economy is in a recession or not. And they always decide maybe about a year after the recession is over. So they come up with a rule of thumb. This is what the Wall Street uses. It's not a formal definition of a recession, but if you have 2 straight quarters of negative growth, then they consider it a recession. But if you apply that definition to Korea, Korea only had perhaps about 4 or 5 recessions since 1965. And a lot of times when Koreans felt that we were in a recession, by that definition, we were not in a recession. So we have to come up with another definition, and a definition that some economists use is growth below the potential growth rate. Now, the problem with that is that right now, Korea's potential growth rate is thought to be around 2.0, maybe slightly higher than that. And this year, we're going to have maybe 2.6% growth if we're very, very lucky. And everybody's saying this is very slow growth. We're going to have problems with it. But it's above the potential growth. So we're not going to be in a recession this year by that definition. Next year, if our growth falls below 2%, then technically maybe you can call it a recession, but not that much. The fundamental problem is that Korea's potential growth has fallen so much in the last couple of decades that even if we achieve potential growth, which is growth that we would have under normal times, it will feel like a recession.
I see. That sounds quite grim, though. Professor Kim, the most, and do correct me if I'm wrong, I understand the most recent global recession was back in the year 2010.
Yeah,
but
right.
even back then, South Korea apparently was one of the few developed countries that managed to grow 6.2% in the year 2010. How was this possible while the rest of the world was going through a recession?
Yeah, basically, as Professor Yang mentioned, recession would be very tough to be defined. But anyway, we say the economic growth is lower than the previous years, and then we say, that's a recession. And then at the time of economic recession in 2010, which was caused by a global financial crisis, and at the time, Korean government moved very, very swiftly. And the Korean Central Bank and together with Korean government lowered interest rate by 3.25% from 5.25% to 2%. That's very in a very short period of time. That's very swift move. And also they provided a lot of liquidity to stabilize the foreign exchange market. And also they put a lot of money into social infrastructures. And also they put a lot of money to support the small and medium enterprises. And also they put a lot of money into social safety networks. So that was, very expansive financial expenditures by government. That was, I think, very proactive. And then it helped a lot, for Korean government to overcome that recession that fast. And also, what we had was as fundamentally, after the 1998 foreign exchange crisis, Korean companies had very strong fundamentals. They did a lot of restructuring, and they did a lot of re-engineering. They lowered their debt level dramatically. So they had a very strong, healthy conditions to overcome or to respond to those kind of economic crises.
Right, I see. Professor Yang, moving ahead, quite a number of established entities believe Korea's economic expansion for next year will be on the 2% range or slightly below, like the upper 1% range. What efforts do you suppose may perhaps serve to bolster Korea's growth next year against such an outlook?
Well, the government is hoping that they can increase exports, and they have announced investment plans to increase exports. Now, I think that's something that should have been done anyway. But still, problem with trying to increase exports is that Koreans do not buy exports. It's the foreigners who buy exports, and Korean government cannot force foreigners to buy Korean products. At best, they can reduce the cost of exporting, so it'll improve slightly, but fundamentally, until the global demand comes back, you can't really count on increasing Korea's exports. So you're going to have to try to increase Korea's domestic expenditure. That's basically consumption and investment. And perhaps the government the traditional government measures to try to increase consumption is temporary reduction in consumption taxes, more credit for credit card usage, and for investment, temporary advanced depreciation or temporary tax breaks for investment. And I think these are something that should be done. But the problem is that it'll be, even with these policies, it'll be very difficult to increase consumption and investment because Korea has a lot of household and corporate debt, and it's going to be also a period with a high interest rate. So both households and businesses are going to have to pay a lot in interest. That naturally means that they don't have enough money left over for consumption and investment. So I think the best that the government can do is try to increase government expenditure, but then the government may have to go back on their promise that they will not increase government deficit. So we're sort of in a situation where everything, well, we should have reduced corporate debt and household debt earlier, but we let it fester for about 15 years, and now it's coming home to roost.
Right. Well, the government has a daunting task ahead of it then. All right, Professor Yang, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Kim, thank you very much for your insights today.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Right. Well, on that note, we end Friday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Have a good weekend. See you next Monday.